2022. Thanks, Annie. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the third and final session of our Spring 2022 virtual author presentations. Quick note for those of you who are not able to attend our recent session in May with Tiffany Midge, the recording for that is available on our website. My name is Amelia Velasic, and I am the Partnerships and Programs Supervisor for the Idaho Commission for Libraries. I will also be your host today. I wanted to take a few moments at the top of our hour together to go over some housekeeping items, provide a little bit of background about the program, and introduce today's speaker. First, a few quick housekeeping items. If you have any technical issues during today's session, please use the chat feature to send us a message. Annie Gaines is with us today as our behind-the-scenes expert, and she can help you navigate any technical issues. If you have questions for the author that you would like to answer during the question and answer session, please use the Q&A feature to submit those. This will make sure that we don't miss anyone's questions. And you can submit questions through the Q&A feature at any time during the author's presentation, and we'll make sure to get those when we transition to the Q&A session. And finally, please be sure to complete our session feedback form. We'll post a link to that in the chat later. So if all goes according to plan, here's how today's session will proceed. Our distinguished guests will present for about 30 minutes, and this will be followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. And finally, I'll wrap up our time together with some closing remarks and information about next year's Let's Talk About It program. So now for a little bit of information, background information about the program before I introduce today's author. This virtual encore series is being presented in partnership between the Idaho Commission for Libraries and the Idaho Humanities Council. For over 30 years, these two organizations have partnered to bring book discussion programs to libraries statewide. The Let's Talk About It program brings together humanities scholars and adult readers in public libraries to read and discuss literature, which explores American values, history, and culture. This year, in addition to the programs hosted locally at public libraries, we have added this statewide virtual series to our repertoire. We're excited to connect with the authors from 3 of our newest program titles as they share their insights and experiences and provide us with new depth and understanding about their books. Today's presenter is Reyna Grande, author of The Distance Between Us. In this best-selling memoir, Grande writes about her life before and after she arrived in the United States from Mexico as an undocumented child immigrant. Reyna was 2 years old when her father left for the US to find work. Her mother followed her father north 2 years later, leaving Reyna and her siblings behind in Mexico. When she was 9, she made her own journey north across the U.S. Mexico border to be reunited with her family. Reyna became the first person in her family to set foot in a university and later became an accomplished writer. Ms. Grande's book is one of the newest titles to be added to our perennially popular Let's Talk About It theme of biographies and autobiographies. On the surface, the books featured in this theme allow readers to experience life and ideas from the perspective of someone else. But at a deeper level, these texts also take readers on a journey with the author to confront the limits of memory, understand the connection between past and present, and witness the creation of a compelling narrative from a series of discrete dates, events, and memories. Ms. Grande's work has appeared in the New York Times, the Dallas Morning News, CNN, the Washington Post, among many others. In March of 2020, she was a guest on Oprah's Book Club. She is the recipient of numerous awards and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. She is also the author of 6 books, including the recently published novel called A Ballad of Love and Glory, which is set during the Mexican-American War. I've also been informed today that The Distance Between Us is getting reissued, which is very exciting, and I believe that Ms. Grande will be talking a little bit about that as well. So Reyna, we are so excited to have you here with us today. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm so excited to be here and to be able to share a little bit of my story with you all. So first of all, as you heard, The Distance Between Us is gonna have its 10th anniversary edition coming out this fall in September. And I'm gonna share my screen because I wanna share my the new cover with you. So let me see. So can you see that? So this is gonna be the new cover for the book, and I'm very excited about it. I wasn't too crazy about this cover. I felt there was a lot of dirt. And every time I looked at it, I just felt like, wow, like, there's a lot of dirt on this cover. But I really love this new cover that is gonna be featured for the 10th anniversary edition. And as you can see, it's just beautiful, beautiful, the different blues. And then there's the mother holding her daughter who is kind of just disappearing into the clouds. And when I saw this cover, I felt that it conveyed that distance that I write about in the book. And it especially touched me, this image of a mother and daughter, because it's one of the things that even to this day, like it still hurts me, just that idea of having lost my mother at a young age when she immigrated to the United States. And even though eventually we were reunited, our relationship was never the same again. So this is why this cover touched me so deeply. Also, I'm very excited to share, if you can see at the bottom right here, um, Sandra Cisneros, my literary godmother and a person that I deeply admire. She was so generous to write the foreword for the 10th anniversary edition. So that is something I'm just so grateful about, and I can't wait for you to read her beautiful foreword. And then I also wrote a new introduction for the book. So I'm gonna stop sharing now. And the introduction for the book, it allowed me, for me to kind of reflect on this last 10 years that the book has been out. And I want to share it with you. And after I read it, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the process of writing The Distance Between Us and the challenges of writing memoir, in particular, writing a childhood memoir. So this is the introduction to The Distance Between Us. That's gonna be featured in the 10th anniversary edition, but you don't have to wait till September because I'm gonna read it and share it with you now. In February 2020, I was invited to be a guest speaker on a television special for Oprah's book club. While on the show, I said something that had taken me a long time to claim. Now I realize that being a border crosser is my superpower. It took me years of writing and self-reflection to get to the place where I could see my immigrant journey, including my immigrant trauma, as my greatest source of strength. Before I wrote The Distance Between Us, I hadn't gotten to that place of discovery yet. I didn't know it, but I felt it, that I needed to write this book. After so many years of enduring discrimination and microaggressions in the United States, I've grown ashamed of my border crossing, my immigrant identity, and my Mexican roots. To hide this part of me and remain silent was an option, but it was one that in the end would have led to even more shame and trauma. So instead, I made a different choice. I decided to confront my past and reframe it. Writing my immigrant story was an act of rebellion. It was a way of pushing back against a society that forces its immigrants, especially immigrants of color, to hide or deny who they are. Writing my own story on my own terms was liberating, empowering. I didn't know that this act of self-empowerment would lead to others' empowerment too, but the emails and letters I have received from readers through the years, especially those from immigrants and children of immigrants, tell a different story. When readers tell me they see themselves reflected in the distance between us, I know that by finding the courage to tell my story, I've inspired others to celebrate theirs too. It makes me excited to see that in the past decade, the literature written by the undocumented has grown. But as I expressed to Oprah on her show, the opportunities to publish such stories are still limited, and immigrant writers continue to be underpublished, underrepresented, and underpaid. I also wrote The Distance Between Us as a call for change. I've grown tired of how our political leaders have failed the immigrant community again and again. I hope that writing about my experiences, being separated from my parents, crossing the border, and coming of age in the US as an undocumented immigrant would contribute to the conversation on immigration in a way that centered our humanity. Instead of statistics, I offered a deeply personal story of a young Mexican immigrant trying to find her place in the US while striving to reach her full potential. While I was writing this book, the Dream Act failed to pass again. People like me who came to this country as children were denied the opportunity to legalize their status and make a permanent home here. Then in 2012, 2 months before the publication of The Distance Between Us, Barack Obama, who was up for re-election, introduced DACA, a temporary 2-year program that offers relief from deportation and a work permit to dreamers at a hefty fee. But a 2-year program can never offer its recipients what comprehensive immigration reform and a pathway to citizenship could give: a chance to build a life, a future on something permanent and long-term. The quarantines and lockdowns we've all experienced in the area of COVID-19 provide insight into the chronic anxiety undocumented immigrants suffer when attempting to plan their lives. We all know firsthand what it's like to try to make plans for the next month or holiday and suffer through the anxiety of not knowing if any of it would even be possible. Undocumented immigrants live with this uncertainty every day of their lives. Soon after the young reader's version of The Distance Between Us came out in the fall of 2016, Donald Trump became president and anti-immigrant sentiment reached an all-time high. Family separations also reached new heights. It had never been so clear to me how different my story is from the immigrants of today. And even now, I can't forget that when I was writing The Distance Between Us and then its sequel, A Dream Called Home, I was doing so from a place of privilege. I am now a US citizen. I live an upper middle class life as a college graduate and a professional writer. In short, I had nothing to lose by telling my own story. The American dream that I am now enjoying could easily have turned into the American nightmare that others are enduring today. Though migration to the United States has always had its perils, I know that if I were to have crossed the border today instead of in the 1980s, this book probably wouldn't even exist. The truth is that I might have faced a completely different fate than the undocumented success story I wrote about in my memoirs. And yet, I've also come to understand that had I not immigrated to the US and taken advantage of every opportunity life afforded me, I wouldn't be the writer I am today. And the thought that had circumstances been different, I might have never had books and writing in my life gives me tremendous grief. Despite the trauma I've endured before, during, and after my migration journey, despite the hoops I've had to jump through to finally be allowed to make a home here, despite the fact that I will have to keep earning my right to remain and work hard so that others see me as someone who deserves to be here, the sacrifices have been worth it. I was reminded of this when The Distance Between Us was published in Mexico in 2017. I traveled to Oaxaca to participate as a featured speaker as part of the city's annual book fair. Over the years, I have returned to Mexico every so often to visit my relatives, but this was my first time visiting my native country to participate in a book festival. This event meant so much to me. My journey since I immigrated had been long and arduous, and now I had returned to the land of my birth, feeling proud of what I had accomplished. I had transformed myself from an undocumented immigrant to a university graduate and best-selling author. It didn't take long for my visit to turn from sweet to bitter. I discovered that in Mexico, my book sells for 220 pesos, or about $16, about the same price as it costs here in the United States. But the minimum daily wage in Mexico, especially in poor rural areas like the city where I was born, is around 100 pesos. In other words, if Mexicans want to buy my book, it will cost them 2 days worth of wages. For poor families like mine, reading is a luxury. You either eat or you read. It is no wonder then that although I had about 200 people in the audience at my event, most of them handed me a piece of paper to autograph instead of a book at the signing. After the day's events, the book fair organizers hosted the authors for dinner at a fancy restaurant in downtown Oaxaca. We were inside eating mole negro and drinking mezcal, talking about our writing careers, the book fair panels, our current projects. Outside of the restaurant, I could see children looking through the windows and glass doors, trying to get our attention. They had trays of gum and candy they wanted to sell to us. If any of them tried to get in, the restaurant staff would quickly usher them out. That used to be me, I thought, as I watched them shaking their trays. I remember myself as a little girl back in my hometown in Iguala, carrying boxes of candy, gum, and cigarettes, hoping to sell enough to have something to eat that day. I was suddenly split in half. Half of me, the best-selling author Reyna Grande, was in that restaurant, drinking and rubbing elbows with distinguished writers. The other half of me, little Reyna, was outside, hungry and helpless, looking at that other me through the glass doors. That visit to my native country reminded me of this irrefutable fact. I wouldn't be a writer today if I had never come to the United States. As I looked around the restaurant at the writers with whom I had shared the stage and celebrated our publishing accomplishments, the thought that kept going through my head was that if things had been different, instead of their peer, I could have been their maid. In California, I found opportunities that I didn't have in my hometown. But one small basic thing that would have a tremendous impact on my life was this: access to a public library. In neighborhoods like the one where I was born, public libraries don't exist. With little or no access to books, there were no readers in my family, let alone writers. My maternal grandfather was illiterate. My father only made it to the 3rd grade, and my mother didn't get past 6th grade. They never developed the habit of reading or came to love books. They literally couldn't afford to. Not all readers are writers, but all writers are readers. And that was true in my case. But in my native country, I would have been neither. Luckily for me, by immigrating, books were suddenly within my reach. I was in junior high school the first time I set foot in the Arroyo Seco Public Library in Northeast Los Angeles, near my school. I quickly came to love it. I was desperate to learn English so I could get out of the ESL program I had been placed in and rid myself of the stigma of being an English language learner. Reading books, especially books on tape, now called audiobooks, is how I learned the language. Every week, I stopped by the public library to check out 10 books, the maximum I was allowed to borrow. I devoured them and came back for more. Soon, I wasn't reading to learn English. I was reading because I fell in love with stories, and then I began to write my own. As a low income, formerly undocumented immigrant, English language learner, and first generation college student, I had a long fight to become a professional writer. After all, I was trying to make a career in an industry where not many people like me exist. I had to write my way into existence. I knocked down barriers with my pen, built bridges with my words. The dream I am now living is woven with the stories I write. But the one thing I'll never forget is that my story could have been a tragedy instead of a fairy tale. Through the years, I am often confronted with the realization of how close I came to not living the life I have now. If my family and I had crossed the border in today's America instead of in 1985, I would have been separated from my father when we got caught by Border Patrol, and he would have been blamed for our separation. I would have been one of the thousands of children thrown into a cage, or worse, I could have died in the crossing, which, due to the border wall that was approved by the first Bush administration, then constructed in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, and then expanded incrementally in the decades that followed, is so much more dangerous now than it was in the 80s. When I read the horror stories in the news of migrant children being found dead in the desert or washing up on the banks of the Rio Grande, rest in peace, Valeria Martinez, I think that could have been me. That could be you. I hear teachers tell their immigrant students whenever I speak at high schools and colleges around the country. I am an undocumented success story now. I am the candy girl who escaped her poverty, who didn't get locked up, who didn't get deported. I'm the girl living the dream, but I never forget about those who are still on the outside looking in. Thank you for reading The Distance Between Us. Now my dream is to see more immigrant stories being read and celebrated. I want to see immigrant writers being given the opportunity to write their own stories on their own terms and being recognized for their contributions to American literature. But above all, I want all immigrants to be treated with respect and with the dignity they deserve. Maybe one day we as a country can finally be proud to claim that our superpower is our immigrant community. Thank you. So this is the introduction to The Distance Between Us. And, you know, as you heard in the introduction, one of the things I have been thinking a lot about, especially in this past years, especially hearing about the unaccompanied minors that have been coming to the border, all the children, right, that have been separated from their parents, who have been detained, thrown in cages, and then hearing the parents being blamed for the situation. And then, of course, seeing all these tragedies unfolding at the border, children dying during the crossings. To me, like I'm constantly thinking, about my own journey and feeling grateful about even though my journey was challenging, and even to this day, I'm still kind of trying to overcome the trauma that I suffered. It's nothing compared to what immigrants of today are dealing with, especially children. And so I try to think about that, and I try to feel, be grateful about the opportunities that I've had. And especially now in my career as a writer, um, one of the things I've been doing more is to try to help other immigrant writers get published and be able to tell their stories and share their stories with the world. And so one of my books that just came out 3 weeks ago is this book, Somewhere We Are Human. It's an anthology of undocumented immigrant voices. And I co-edited this anthology with Sonia Willansaka, who is a poet and an activist. And so in this anthology, we gathered 41 voices, essayists and poets who share their experiences being undocumented. And many of them are DACA recipients. And as you heard, DACA was introduced just 2 months before the publication of The Distance Between Us. So DACA just celebrated also, or it just turned 10 last week. And so some of our contributors in Somewhere We Are Human reflect on DACA, on how it has changed their lives in positive and negative ways. And then one particular piece that was very poignant was Elias Roldan, who writes about being too old to qualify for DACA, because I think the cutoff age for DACA was like 32 or 35, and he was 40, and he didn't qualify for DACA. And so like he reflects on that, and the challenges that he faced. So to me, like that has been something that I have been very happy about, being able to use whatever opportunities I've had to then help other immigrants tell their own stories, because no immigrant story is unique. And even though in the distance between us, I think people find a lot of similarities in my story with their story. Every immigrant story is singular, and every immigrant has a unique voice that deserves to be heard. So before I open it up for questions, one of the things I wanted to share was a little bit about the process of writing The Distance Between Us, because when I studied creative writing, I actually studied fiction. And so when I began to write, when I went to college and I majored in creative writing, I was a fiction concentration major. And so every class I took was just fiction, fiction, fiction. And even though I wanted to write about my own experiences, I did it, but from a fiction angle. And so my first book, Across 100 Mountains, is a novel. It's an autobiographical novel, or a semi-autobiographical novel. And I did that because I was more comfortable writing fiction than I was writing memoir. And so in my very first book, one of the things I did was instead of writing about the life I had lived, I wrote about the life I might have lived if my father had never come back for me. Because one of the things that haunt me, even to this day, I ask myself, what would have been of my life if my father had never come back to Mexico for me? And so in Across 100 Mountains, I wrote a story of a young girl in living in poverty in Mexico, whose father comes to the United States to look for work because he wants to build his family a house in Mexico. So I took that from my own experience. But then after that, the father never comes back and the family never hears from him again. And so eventually the young girl has to leave her hometown by herself and go in search of her father and find out what happened to him. So that's where, it diverges from my own experience, because obviously, my father did come back, but in this book, he doesn't. And so I was exploring the what if my father had never come back? What would have been of my life? And so in this book gave me the opportunity to explore my fear as a child of being abandoned by my father. So I wrote this book, and I wrote another novel after that, Dancing with Butterflies. And once I had written these two books, I felt more confident as a writer to now be able to transition into memoir writing. And I had never taken a memoir writing class. All I took was fiction classes. And so I had no idea what to do in terms of how to write a memoir. And I really, really struggled with it at first. I didn't know how to go about it. Um, I just kept writing my memories. And then eventually, like, I finished a draft. It was just it read like a collection of memories, but it didn't have a structure. It didn't have a narrative arc. There was hardly any dialogue, because I thought, well, when you write memoir, you have to write the truth, and I couldn't remember the dialogue. I couldn't remember the conversations and what everybody had said. So then I wouldn't allow my characters to speak at all. So there was hardly any dialogue in the book. And so then I, I had some mentors guiding me, and I realized that what I really needed to do was that I had to use what I was good at, which is writing fiction, to write the memoir. And so I took out all of my novelist tools to be able to write it. And by that, I mean, when I write fiction, the first thing I do is I have to figure out the narrative structure for the book. I have to figure out the plot points. I have to really deeply study the characters. So all of these things that I had learned in writing a novel, then I had to apply it to the memoir, because the other thing that was not working in my memoir is how my characters were very undeveloped, because I thought, since I'm writing about real people, they're going to be real to the reader. But I didn't realize, that no, that it also takes as much work to bring to life real characters on the page as it does fictional characters. And so I just started to to tackle the book in a way I would have tackled a novel. And once I did that, I managed to then figure out what the structure was going to be. I separated the book into two parts. Part one takes place in Mexico, part two takes place in the US, and the midpoint is the border crossing. And then I figured out the inciting incident, the plot points. Um, and I also was able to think about my family members that I write about, and study them and learn about them, and especially my parents. And that was very helpful for me, because I realized that I was too close to my parents, because I kept seeing them and writing about them through the eyes of their daughter. And so that was kind of filtered and distorted by all these different conflicting emotions that I have about my parents. But once I decided to study them in the way I would study fictional characters, it gave me some distance to be able to learn more about them, and to look at, everything that made them who they were, the society in which they grew up, the family in which they grew up, what were their dreams, what made them who they were, and what made them the parents that they were. So all of these things really helped me. And the other thing was figuring out the voice. I kind of struggled with the voice, because I I sometimes like I was writing from the adult Reyna looking back, and that was not working because the adult Reyna was dealing with different things. And so I decided to kind of keep the adult Reyna out and just allow my child self to tell the story. And so once I did that, once I was able to tap into the child's voice, it allowed me to write the story the way it needed to be told, because my child self had a different perspective. It had a different understanding of what was going on back then. And then it felt more immediate because as soon as I tapped into my child self, I felt that I was there reliving every single moment. And so there's a more like there's this immediacy in the storytelling where you feel that you're there, that you're experiencing these moments with little Reyna. And so by removing my adult self, I was also less judgmental of what was going on. So that's how I, it took me about 4 years to finally find the right way to tell the story. And when I finished it, I felt so liberated because writing this memoir, it was therapy for me. It forced me to confront my past. It forced me to relive difficult moments in a way where I could transform these traumatic moments into art that I could then share with others. And then it also allowed me to understand the things that had happened and why they happened, and what I gained and what I lost from these experiences. And then it also brought me to a place of more compassion for my parents, more understanding and forgiveness. And so I was a better person by the time I finished writing this book. And I'm really glad that I was able to write this book, and then also, to write the sequel. And the distance between us took me 4 years to write, but A Dream Called Home, I wrote it in 1 year, because when I started this memoir, now I knew how to write memoir, and I knew exactly what it was that I needed to do to be able to put it together, and how to structure it, and how to find the plot points and all of those things. So I'm gonna stop right there so that I can give you guys time to ask questions. And again, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you so much for elevating immigrant voices. And I hope that you can keep reading more of these memoirs, more of these stories that really do deserve to be read.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting because, again, to remind the audience that this book was particularly chosen to be included in our theme of biographies and autobiographies. So in addition to understanding the experiences that you went through, understanding that writing process is just, it's really great insight for that theme. I do have a couple questions coming in. I'm going to give folks a few more minutes to just sort of absorb what they've heard. I know that there's some groups that are joining us live. That's like maybe a group of people joining from the library, so it might take them a few moments to collect their questions and have their librarian type those in as well. So as I'm kind of letting people get those thoughts formulated, I just had a couple follow-up questions. It was really interesting to me because I have a lot of questions about the process of writing a memoir.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just really insightful to hear about how you kind of had to step back and view your parents as characters, which gave you this objective perspective of what they were going through as human beings,
Mm-hmm.
and not just your perspective of them as a child who experienced trauma and love and all the other things that happen in a family. I'm curious, when you're writing a memoir, you're writing about real people. And I know that I believe that your father passed
Mm-hmm.
before the book was published, but I assume that other people in your family are, still here. And what was that like to have this memoir published where the people in the book are real people? Did you have any
Yeah.
concerns about that, and how did you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, when I wrote The Distance Between Us, I didn't I didn't know that it was okay for you to withhold information. So I kind of just laid it all out, I aired all the dirty laundry. And by the time I wrote A Drink Called Home, I realized that no, that you can set, you know, some kind of boundaries,
Mhm.
but especially to protect the privacy of the people that you're writing about. And so in The Distance Between Us, I was very, very open with our experience as a family, writing about my siblings and my parents. And then of course, we were all children. So even though sometimes we did things that were questionable, we were not at our best, because we were children, the reader kind of understands that and forgives that more easily than later if I write about, writing about things that we did as adults, that then it got a little tricky, especially if I was writing about my siblings. But when I wrote The Distance Between Us, I involved my siblings a lot in the writing process. Especially, I borrowed their memories because in the early part of the book, the book starts when I'm 4.5. And so I didn't remember everything. And so I had to like talk to my older sister about like what she remembered. So she kind of filled in the gaps of my memory. And my brother also did the same thing. He gave me a lot of his memory. So then together we put together our story. And I thought it was a beautiful process of that. It was what I remember, what my sister remembered, and what my brother remembered. And then from that, you get a really good sense of our childhood. And they loved being part of this process. And my father passed away while I was writing the book, but then that allowed me to think about my father in a way where, I really wanted the reader to understand my father, that yes, he had a lot of failings, but he also had a lot of good intentions too, you know. And so like the way I want the reader to feel about my father is to understand that he was a good man, and he tried, and then he was also derailed by his addictions and um, his violence, his nature, and his own traumas as an immigrant, and his own traumas of growing up in a very abusive household. So the only complaint I ever got for The Distance Between Us was from my father's sisters, who were very mad at me about what I had written about my paternal grandmother,
Mm.
and they said, well, your grandma died. Why do you have to be writing all these mean things about her, and you have to honor her memory. And so they were upset.
Mm.
But again, this was my reality. This is how my grandmother behaved, and I didn't write this book out of revenge. I wasn't trying to take revenge on my grandmother or on anybody else that had hurt me. I was just trying to tell my truth, and it made some people uncomfortable. So yeah, so then in a Drink Called Home, um because I was now writing about our adulthood, I was trying to be more aware of how much to write about my siblings, because I didn't want to write things that to invade their privacy.
Mhm.
So, for example, there's a chapter in the book where I write about my sister leaving her husband, and I asked her if she was okay with me including that chapter. And she said she was. So, and I gave it to her so she could read what I had written. So she was okay with that. So those are some of the things that I did, to make sure that people were okay with what I was writing. But it doesn't happen all the time with memoirs. It gets kind of challenging navigating that space of how much can you say
Mhm.
and how are the other people going to feel about what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, thanks. That's really fascinating to kind of hear about that process. We do have a few questions that have come in from the audience. The first couple of them kind of are going back, I think, less about your experience as a writer and more just kind of questions with regard to, the immigration process. I'm going to try and phrase them a little bit here. So the first question kind of has to do with, you entered the United States illegally, and there's different ways of coming into the United States. There's, ostensibly legally and illegally, and I don't know enough about the immigration process to really understand what
Mm-hmm.
a legal immigration process looks like. I'm a librarian, not a immigration lawyer, but there's a kind of a question about, when you were growing up in the United States, how did you reconcile having entered the country illegally, knowing that there were people who maybe were trying to obtain the same opportunities through other channels? And is there,
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, what does that mean for you, how your
Yeah.
experience may have differed?
Well, the thing is that no immigrant wants to come here illegally. No person wants to risk their lives to cross the border. We are forced to do that because the opportunities to come here legally are very, 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 very few. We were economic refugees, and that never, ever is never a good thing because there are no countries that want to take on people who are escaping poverty, right? And so we had really no opportunity whatsoever to come here legally. Just to get a visa, even a tourist visa, you have to have money, you have to have wealth, you have to have money in the bank, you have to own land. Like there's all these different requirements for you to be able to even get a tourist visa to come here. And a lot of the immigration that legal immigration that happens is people come here with visas and then they overstay their visas and they become undocumented immigrants. So the only difference between those people and me is that they qualified for a visa because they had the means to do so. And then, and my family did not. So we had to come the other way, which was to try to sneak across the border because that was the only alternative the only option that we have. And so it's been very difficult, through the years. Ever since I arrived, it's become even harder to get any kind of work visa that would allow people to come here and work legally and then go back home. And that used to happen before. There was a lot of back and forth going on. The border was a little bit more porous that way, in that, migrants would come for a season, work, and then go back home. And then the next year they'll come back, work, and then go home. But because things have become harder, that doesn't happen anymore.
Mm.
And so they're trapped here and they can't go anywhere. And when I arrived in 1985, the year after, that was when IRCA passed. Under the Reagan administration, they passed the amnesty that allowed like 3 billion people, undocumented people, to legalize their status. And ever since 1986, we haven't had immigration reform.
Mm.
So that door has completely closed on immigrants. So I know that, we want to blame immigrants for being here illegally, but the truth is that we haven't really given them a lot of options in terms of how to adjust their status or how to come here legally. So to me, it's it's a question of, if we don't want illegal immigration, then let us increase legal
Mm.
migration.
Well, thanks. And I know it's a difficult topic. I know there's a lot of people who have strong opinions, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it and to understand the issue better for myself personally, because I don't, I mean, to be honest, I don't understand it as well as I probably ought to. So I appreciate your insight. Another question had asked, and I think you kind of maybe answered this a little bit. They asked whether your book on crossing and gaining all of the opportunities might possibly encourage others to do the same. But I also feel like you kind of talked about how even purchasing your book for folks living in Mexico is not really a viable thing. So I don't know, I think probably the fact that they would even have access to the book is probably in question itself. There was I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, but what I do want to do with my books is, the young people that are growing up here, whether they're immigrants or not. I did write it with the intention of inspiring them to pursue their dreams, and that's something that I really love to do. That's why, like, I do a lot of high school visits, I do a lot of college visits, because I'm always encouraging young people to pursue the goals that they have, despite, there's all these obstacles that we need to overcome, that we're constantly faced with, especially if you're undocumented, right? Like, there's so many different obstacles, but to me, it's important to keep encouraging them to keep going, to keep fighting for their dreams. The ones that are here trying to make a life here,
Right.
I want them to feel inspired, because they get discouraged. I mean, look at how many times the Dream Act has failed to pass, and just not having opportunities, right, that they need, and seeing all these doors closing on them. They need to keep hearing that no, that they can't give up, that they have to keep going.
That's great. I think we have time for one more question. And this one gets back kind of again to more of the writer's perspective and the literary perspective. Somebody asked, which literary works have been the most important to you as a reader?
Literary words, well, I mean, Sandra Cisneros, The House on Mango Street was the book that gave me permission to pursue a career as a writer, because it was the first book where I saw myself. I didn't really have access to works by Chicana Latina writers when I was growing up, and I read a lot. But they were all, mostly white writers that I was reading. And so when I found The House on Mango Street and I read it, it gave me permission to start dreaming that dream, that I too could publish one day and be like Sandra.
And just a quick follow-up question for me. We don't have any more audience questions coming in, but as somebody who also enjoys writing, not a published author, but just who's always just enjoyed writing, and I'm sure there are other people in the audience probably as well who've taken pen to paper here and there, and I'm just wondering if you have any advice for any aspiring writers in the audience.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think you have to decide what you want to do with your writing, because if you don't want to publish and you just love to write for yourself, then I would say, well, keep doing that. You don't need to study the craft. You just write what you feel, you write what comes out, and, write in your journal just for you. But if your goal is to one day publish your writing, then you do have to start working on the craft, right? You have to, like, I would recommend that you take some classes, that you start building a community of other writers around you, maybe start a writing group and you can exchange work with other people and get feedback, and take yourself through that process of learning how to revise, and then also go to, like, uh, book festivals, writers conferences, where you're going to meet other people in the industry, especially like agents, editors, that kind of thing. And that way you can slowly start to learn more about the not just the craft, but also the business side of writing,
Mm.
and also submitting your work. That's a big part of being a writer, is submitting your work and trying to get your work out there. So that's another thing that it's good to learn. And I really love Poets and Writers, the magazine. They have a really wonderful website. So if you Google Poets and Writers magazine, will take you to their website, and they have a list of all the writers' conferences and residencies and book fairs going on. They have a list of all these writing competitions going on where you could submit your work. And grants that you can apply for. So I would start there if you do want to, start learning more about how to get published.
Great, thank you so much. And there's quite a few comments in the chat that we'll try to capture, and most of them just words of support and interest in your other works, and possibly even contacting you to come speak. So we'll make sure to get that information to you as well. And just some comments. Looks like there was something submitted in the question and answer, which is more of a comment and less of a question, but I'd be happy to pass that along to our speaker today as well. But we are kind of at our time. So I just have a few closing remarks. Just to let everybody know that this is the last session of our virtual author discussion, but the Let's Talk About It program will be operating at the public libraries next fall. So if we have any public librarians on the call today, please know that today is the last day to get your application submitted to participate in that. And Reyna, thank you so much for joining us today. What a wonderful conversation. I feel like I've learned so much and feel so inspired by your story and by your journey as a writer. Just very grateful for your time here today. And
Thank
let's
you so
see.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you everybody for joining us.
Yeah, and if for those of you who registered, you'll be getting a follow-up email with the link to the feedback form. So if there's any feedback you'd like to provide to us, there will also be access to the video recording of this meeting. So I'm going to hang out for a few more minutes in case there's any questions about follow-up from anybody in the audience. Reyna, thank you so much. I know your time is very valuable, so we'll follow up with you later, but thank you again so much. It was just a blessing to have you here today.
Thank you.